because I didn't have any uncles and aunts and grandparents, cousins around the place, I was always asking my mother about her life growing up, her school days, her hobbies, her sports, and about the family. So she started to tell me in tiny snippets of her wartime experiences as she felt that I could cope with the details. So I can tell you the very first thing she ever did tell me. I was about 6 or 7, and I came home from school and I noticed on the back of the kitchen door there was a brown suede shopping bag, and it had the initials A.N. My mother's name was Anna or Anka, and her first married name was Nathan, so A.N. I didn't have the surname Nathan because my stepfather officially adopted me before we left Prague. So I said to her, "What are those letters?" And she took a deep breath, apparently psychologically, and she thought, here we go. And she said, "Well, you had 2 daddies. And one daddy was killed in the war, and I've got another daddy. That is all," she said. As I grew older, so the replies became more detailed. My father was German but Jewish, and in 1933 he realized he should leave Germany, and he managed to get to Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. He thought that was far enough to be safe. It wasn't, but if he hadn't have come to Prague, he wouldn't have met my mother, and I would not be talking to you now. And they married on the 15th of May 1940, which was already under Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. My mother had been a law student at the Charles University, and, you know, at the beginning, they sort of coped, they managed with the Nuremberg laws as people did, especially young people, because the Nuremberg laws happened very gradually. People just got used to them. You know, so you were forbidden to do this or you're forbidden to do that. If it's gradual, you just accept it, especially if you're young. Anyway, but despite all that, at the end of November, the beginning of December of 1941, my father was deported to Theresienstadt, which was the camp in Czechoslovakia, about 40 miles north of Prague. Before the war, it had been a garrison town where Czech soldiers were stationed. But when the Germans invaded, the Czech army was disbanded, and the Germans turned this place into a ghetto and a concentration camp. And as I said, my father was amongst the first transports to be sent there, because he'd been an architect and interior designer, and because he was young and strong and well able to work, so he was sent amongst the first transports to help set it up. They didn't have any option, but that's it. And my mother was sent a few weeks later. And unknown to them, they were to spend the next 3 years in Terezín, which was a remarkably long, very unusually long period of time, because to a large extent Terezín was a transit camp for the death camps, because there were various categories of people who would have been sent to their deaths quite quickly. And amongst those groups of people would have been the old, the sick, mothers with children, pregnant women, the mentally disabled, the physically disabled. But as I've already said, because my parents were young, strong and well able to work, they remained there for 3 years, which was a very unusually long period of time. And my mother always said luck had an awful lot to do with it. But at the end of September of 1944, their luck ran out, because it was on that day that my father was sent to Auschwitz. And incredibly, my mother actually volunteered to follow him the very next day. And the reason she volunteered to follow him was because she had no idea where he'd been sent. And being the eternal optimist, she thought, well, as they had survived 3 years up to that point, she thought, well, nothing could get any worse. Little did she know. But she thought nothing could get any worse. They would survive. But in fact, she never, ever saw my father again. And she heard from an eyewitness, a friend, quite soon after the end of the war, that my father had actually been shot dead on a death march near Auschwitz on the 18th of January 1945. And as you know, it was liberated by the Russians on the 27th of January 1945. Now, during those 3 years that they were in Terezín, I have to tell you about 2 very important facts you will appreciate, because they concern my brother and his conception, me and my conception. When families first arrived in Terezin, that is the first time that those families would have been split up. So men were sent to one barracks, women to another, elderly people to another, children to yet another. They were able to meet up sometimes during the day, but to a large extent they led separate lives. And in 1943, my mother discovered that she was actually pregnant. And when I was, curious teenager, I said to her, "So how come you got pregnant? You weren't my father." She replied in a very clever way. She said, "Well," she said, "it was very, very, very dangerous. But your father and I got together secretly, as and when we could, and to hell with the consequences, end of story." But it was not the end of the story, and it had very, very serious consequences, because to become pregnant in a concentration camp was considered by the Nazis to be a crime punishable by death, because they were trying to annihilate, they were trying to murder every single member of the Jewish people. They couldn't prevent women coming into the camps pregnant, but the reason for the segregations was so that they could not become pregnant while there. And when the Nazis discovered that my mother and 4 other women were also pregnant, they made these 5 couples sign a document that said that when the babies were born, they would have to be handed over to be killed. Except they didn't use the word kill, they used the word euthanasia. My mother had never heard the word euthanasia. She had to go and ask somebody what it meant. In the event, the other 4 babies were born. We don't actually know what happened to those families. We assume they all perished in Auschwitz. When my brother, Jiří means George, he was born in February of 1944. He was not taken away from my parents, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death meant my life and my mother's life, which is a very strange thing to say, but true. Because had my mother arrived in the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp holding my brother in her arms, they would have both been sent straight to the gas chamber. But because she arrived in Auschwitz not holding my brother, and although she was pregnant again, this time with me, nobody knew. She knew, but nobody else knew, and it didn't show, so again, she lived to see another day. Because my mother was still strong enough for work, I have to tell you that, to give you an idea of her strength, when she was 14 years of age, she was school's junior backstroke swimming champion of Czechoslovakia. That gives you an idea of her physical strength. And she always maintained that if this whole experience had to happen to her, she was at the right age, not only physically, but psychologically and emotionally. She was in her mid-20s, she was tough, she was strong. So my mother and a whole group of women, similar age and strength, they were sent out of Auschwitz after a relatively short period of time. I mean, my mother always said that even though she said Auschwitz was sheer hell on earth, it was Dante's Inferno, no other description. But anyway, they couldn't believe their luck when they actually were given a piece of bread and put on a train, and they left Auschwitz. And they were sent to Freiburg, a place in Germany, near in the Saxony, not that far from Dresden, where they were sent to work in an armaments factory, and unknown to my mother and the other women, they were to remain in Freiburg for the next 6 months. That's from October of 1944 to the end of March, the beginning of April of 1945, and the end of the war in Europe was the 8th of May. And during those 6 months, my mother was becoming more and more pregnant and more starved. More and more obviously pregnant and more starved. But fortunately, when the Germans eventually realized she was pregnant, I have to go back. When the women actually arrived in the factory, the very first impression they had was one of bedbugs. The place was crawling on the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling, and they were delighted because it meant that there was some food there, not much, there was some warmth there, not much, and they very quickly ascertained that there were no gas chambers there. After a few days they weren't quite so pleased and the bugs started to bite them, but after what they had been through in Auschwitz, it was negligible. So my mother was in Freiburg for 6 months, and as I said, becoming more and more obviously pregnant, more and more starved. But fortunately, by the time the Germans realized she was pregnant, it was too late to send her back to Auschwitz to be killed, because Auschwitz had been liberated. We do know of cases of pregnant women who were sent back from Freiburg before Auschwitz was liberated, and Mengele took the most unspeakable revenge on them because he felt they'd got away with it. Anyway, so my mother, I have to tell you, my mother was given, in quotes, lighter duties. This was a 4-story factory, right? And she was made to sweep the floors, the staircases, every day, every single day. Those were her lighter duties. And at the end of March, the beginning of April of 1945, this is when the Germans, realizing they were losing the war, and this is when they began to evacuate the camps. They were trying to empty the camps of living witnesses as to what had been going on inside them. And this is when the notorious death marches happened. My mother wasn't on a death march, but she was put on yet another train. And this time it didn't consist of cattle trucks. This time it consisted of coal wagons, open to the skies and filthy. And there were over 2,000 women, 2,000 prisoners, I'm not sure if they were all women, on this train. And my mother was on this train for 17 days with no food and hardly any water. And after the war, when similar trains were discovered and opened up, they were discovered to just have piles of corpses in them. And during this 17-day nightmare of a journey, the train was stopped at some stage. Doors are opened, the dead bodies thrown out, and a farmer walked by, and he saw my mother, and he had such a shock. She described herself as looking like a scarcely living, pregnant skeleton. She weighed 5 stone, 35 kilograms, and she was 9 months pregnant. And this farmer brought her a glass of milk, and there was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he had a whip. And he raised his whip to shoulder height as if to beat my mother if she accepted the glass of milk. But he didn't. He didn't say anything. He lowered his arm and he let her have the glass of milk. And she maintained that saved her life. Who knows? Perhaps it did. I have to tell you, she loathed milk. She liked that glass, but she loathed milk. And the train went on, and it eventually arrived in Mauthausen. And when my mother saw the name Mauthausen at the station, she had such a shock. Because as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz, not knowing what that was, this time she knew, because she had heard about this notorious place from very early on in the war. And she said the shock was so great that she always thought that it possibly provoked the onset of her labour. And she started to give birth to me on that coal truck. She had to climb off the coal truck unaided. She had to climb onto a cart, because the prisoners who were not strong enough to walk up the hill to the camp, they had to get onto carts and they were pulled up by others. She had people lying all over her, people with typhus and typhoid fever, and she proceeded to give birth to me. And there was another Nazi officer who saw that she was in the midst of child labour, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien." You can carry on screaming, because presumably she had been, and she always maintained that she was screaming not only because she was in labour, but because she thought this was her very last minute on this earth. She thought she was about to die. But we both survived the experience. I was born, I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Incredibly, the Germans allowed a doctor to come to my mother, a doctor who was also a prisoner. And presumably they allowed it because, they could hear the guns in the distance. And the doctor came and he cut the umbilical cord and he smacked me to make me cry, to make me breathe. And there are 3 reasons why we survived. And the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas for the gas chamber. My birthday is the 29th. So presumably had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, again I wouldn't be talking to you now. The second indirect reason why we survived was because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. But the last and the best reason why we survived was because on the 5th of May, the American 11th Armoured Division liberated the camp. My mother reckoned she wouldn't have lasted much longer. They think I weighed 3 pounds, 1.5 kilograms. I was wrapped in paper. There were no baby clothes. A baby that size nowadays put straight into an incubator. There were no incubators. But I always maintained perhaps I had the best incubator. My mother just held me all the time.